Evening, everybody. My name is Soten, and I had prepared a Dharma talk for this evening, and then the news happened, and I'm learning once again about how flexible our koans are. If anyone saw the posting this morning online, I had a title and a little paragraph that I was going to sort of focus on our narrow slice of existence these days as we move from being locked down to being freer in the world, and what that feels like, and how that is, for me, something of a fraught experience. But then as I was getting on the bike to come home from the office to get ready to give the Dharma talk, I heard that the verdict in the Derek Chauvin trial was going to be announced. And by the time I got off my bike, it had been. And from the sounds on the street, I wasn't yet sure which way it went. All of you probably know, but perhaps some of you don't, that he is guilty on all three counts. And it's hard for me to talk about something, however profound this experience we're having of moving out of lockdown together is. It just seems such a small historical moment compared to what this highlights. The koan I was going to, that I will use to explore this, although we'll see how I use it, as you'll be as surprised as I am perhaps, is Nanyang's Waterpitcher, Book of Serenity, case 42. And what I put online this morning, thanks to Mukhan, is that a monk asks the national teacher, what is the Vairocana of one's own body? And how can we use that question to shed light on our circumstances, our changing circumstances? So the koan reads, a monk asked national teacher Zhang of Nanyang, what is the Vairocana of one's own body? The national teacher said, bring me the pitcher of clean water. So the monk goes out, brings the pitcher, and the national teacher says, okay, put it back where it was before. So the monk goes out, puts it back, comes back in, and repeats his question. What is the Vairocana of one's body? And the national teacher says, the ancient Buddha is long gone. There's a verse. Birds coursing in the sky, fishes being in the water, in rivers and lakes forgetting, in clouds and sky they get their will. The doubting mind, a single thread, before the face 1,000 miles. Knowing benevolence, requiting benevolence. How many people do? So I think before one can get into the picture, one sort of has to wonder, what's the question? What is the Vairocana of one's own body? So what's Vairocana? It's a word that pops up in our liturgy from time to time. To me, my mind immediately goes to the meal gatha, in which we recite the names of Buddha, clack, pure Dharmakaya Vairocana Buddha, complete Sambhogakaya Vairocana Buddha, numerous Nirmanakaya Shakyamuni Buddhas. So these are referring to classifications of the nature of the body of the Buddha, or the nature of the body of existence. They're philosophical classifications, but reflect some kind of experience of presumably deriving from contemplative practice. And they have different histories and somewhat different takes depending on where and when we're talking. But when you have these three together, what we're talking about in Mahayana Buddhism is what's called the Trikaya, or the kaya means body, the three body forms of a Buddha. And by definition, three body forms of existence. The Dharmakaya is that body which is the undifferentiated, non-dual ground of being. Formless, absolute, beyond existence and non-existence. The third one, numerous Nirmanakaya Shakyamuni Buddhas, these are what in Tibetan tradition, they call the emanation body. This is the forms of existence that arise out of that ground of being with all its differences. And the body of Shakyamuni Buddha, or the many Shakyamuni Buddhas, each one of us, are distinct and separate from each other, even though we're arising from that. And in between, the Sambhogakaya Vairocana Buddha is sort of that liminal state where one is giving way to the other. And in this koan, there's no distinction between the Dharmakaya and the Sambhogakaya. This is, Vairocana in this context means that undifferentiated non-dual awareness that's full of the potential that gives rise to form. So the monk is asking, what is the Vairocana of one's body? And the master sends him out to get a pitcher of clear water. And one way of looking at this is, in its most simple form to me, is this is like Master Chao Chu's eating bowls. The simple act of washing your bowl, the simple act of carrying the water in and carrying the water out with complete presence. That's the Vairocana of one's body. But the monk doesn't see it. The monk is just doing what he's told, marching in and then marching out, and asks his question again, having not necessarily perceived anything from this exercise. That's one way, and certainly a valid way. It's my first approximation of encountering this. And one can easily imagine going into Dokusan and demonstrating one's understanding of the koan with, boom, 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 boom. Which I did. And the teacher with whom I was sitting asked me, how do you feel? Which isn't a question I often get in response to an answer I give in Dokusan. And I thought that was interesting because the feeling I had was of focus and attention and of being embodied in ways that I don't normally consider myself or feel. But then unpacking it further, perhaps this was something, a more specific instruction, because what is that pitcher and the water inside it? And while one can think of the Dharmakaya Vairocana as being completely, if you were going to pick a metaphor, clear, boundless, clean water seems to me like it would be a really good metaphor, in which case the pitcher is the body. And that's one way of looking at it. But in another way, the pitcher is unchanging. The pitcher is always the pitcher. The pitcher always manifests as the pitcher. There is no distinction, there's no difference. It's a little bit counterintuitive in the way that in the Identity of Relative and Absolute Sutra, to me, it surprised me when I first heard it that the absolute is the dark and the relative is the light, because I would have thought, oh, wouldn't it be the other way around? But within the darkness, there are no differences. Within the pitcher, there is no change. And as you walk in with that pitcher and the water sloshes around a little bit, trying to figure out what form to take in response to what it's contained within, which is larger than the water itself. Is this a hint at the nature of the Vairocana in one's own body. In considering it, when I was working on the koan, my life was relatively okay. I wasn't being particularly stressed, and I could focus on this question, philosophical and to some extent experiential, what's my body and what is the Vairocana of this body? But then in recent days, opening up that question to this pervasive anxiety, I'm starting to feel, my husband Mark is starting to feel, people in the Zendo are starting to feel, people at work are starting to feel. Many of us are vaccinated, many of us are not. Our practices are changing. After a long time of having the same unchanging practice, we now face changes that are varying every day as new news comes in and as progress is made with getting vaccinations out there, and resistance to vaccinations increases in some populations. And then resistances of the virus. I meant people before. So what is it to be present with that kind of shifting state? What's the Vairocana of the body that is experiencing change like that moment to moment? Some of it pleasant, exciting even, hope that, oh, maybe we get back to normal or whatever, a more alive version of what we've had in recent years. And how does one become attentive to that? In the Vairocana of one's own body, how does one feel now? And I find just even mentioning those things, I do not feel complacent. I do not feel at ease in my presence. I do not feel settled. I don't feel blissful. But I feel aware by asking that question. What is the Vairocana of my own body in that moment? What is the Vairocana of your body? Hearing me bring up these things. But then here we are, and an historic moment just happened of even grander, greater proportion than this stuff. And part of me really wants, the way part of me wanted the arrival of vaccinations to be a herald of relief. And I'm not feeling particularly relieved yet. The fact that there is a guilty verdict in this case barely feels like a relief. It feels like it took this long to have a moment like this. And what else has happened in our world while this was going on? And why did we have to be so anxious as to whether we would have an outcome like this? Last night on the Rachel Maddow show, she had a film of an interview with Merrick Garland, our new Attorney General, who was in Tulsa, Oklahoma, visiting the Reconciliation Park there, which is what they have as a memorial to what happened in Tulsa, the destruction of the community there 100 years ago, next month. And he got very emotional speaking about the meaning of being in a place like that in the context of his family's history, which I didn't know. I thought with the name Merrick Garland, he was some kind of high New England WASP guy. It turns out his grandparents are from Russia. His grandfather came from the town of Vitebsk, which is the town Chagall painted in the images that eventually became the ones used for Fiddler on the Roof. And a very big part of his own and his family's commitment to social effort and engagement in this country is because this country protected them when they fled the pogroms. And their commitment was to protect others in this country and to foster the same sort of benevolence that his family experienced. And he got really choked up talking about this on the site of Tulsa in the reconciliation plan. A couple of years ago, I went to Riga, which is where my father's parents were sent from Germany and were killed by the Nazis and some helpful Latvians during the Second World War. And saw the little area segregated off where the children coming in on the trains from Germany were put sometimes. And this was around the time when we were putting children in cages down near our southern border. And the vastness of that, finding where my grandmother was killed in the forest, finding the barracks, the remains of the barracks where my grandfather was in concentration camp. The house where they lived actually still exists, where my grandmother lived and some cousins in the Riga ghetto. It's now just a working class neighborhood. The reason I came to Zen practice was very specific. When there was a bunch of stuff forming out of the mists, but I was 14 and I was on a beach in New London, Connecticut with a friend from junior high. And we were talking philosophy as teenagers do. And I said that I had discovered that there was this thing called Jewish mysticism, and that it seemed that one could obtain God's perspective through contemplative practice. And I thought that from the God's eye view, that was how I phrased it, that I would understand what happened in the Holocaust, and that the suffering I felt from carrying that history would dissolve somehow. And that was the beginning of me seeking out some sort of contemplative practice, because it was very specifically a way out from that great suffering, that great question of how can such suffering exist in the world? How can a world like this possibly make sense? And eventually, when I discovered the 3 pillars of Zen and the enlightenment experiences described in there, I thought, oh, okay. So that's what I'm looking for from my Zen practice. I'm looking for that from the get-go. But I'm also looking for that, can I be present in the present moment of doing my job, the task ahead of me, washing my bowls, carrying the pitcher. And to some extent, those are exactly the same thing, and everything intermediate between them, because each of those activities is an expression of one's own body, and each of those has its relationship and arises from the Vairocana of one's own body. Trying to stretch it out to encompass these larger historical things and deeper wounds that we sometimes don't even, well, this year we've had plenty of time to encounter how deep those wounds are in ways that we haven't, many of us haven't, except perhaps intermittently. And the poem, I think, expands on the metaphor of the pitcher, because it's really not sufficient. One of the things I like about that metaphor is, well, what happens if you stumble? Then the water sloshes out. I mean, all sorts of things can happen. You don't necessarily come in stately carrying it along. I remember when Enka Roshi was being made abbot of our Zendo on Barrack Street, and I was honored with the task of coming up with a poem, a celebratory poem, and I had to walk up towards the altar to make the offering as I was reciting the poem, as I recall it, and there was a tatami mat, and I was referring something to her travels from Mexico to Southern California or the other direction. I don't remember her history well enough. And I said something about walking as I was walking, and I tripped on the tatami mat and was humiliated immediately and covered as I would with more words. So I said, walked and tripped her way to California or something like that. And I think it was Roshi Joan came up to me afterwards and said, that was a very Zen moment. And I had no idea what she was talking about. But I was there in the moment with it. Even though it was a mistake, I was there with the mistake. So you drop the picture and it shatters all over the place. That's the Vairocana of one's own body. It's just, you know, it's that Vairocana. But that still doesn't, that's not enough to me. But the verse, birds coursing in the sky, fishes being in the water, in rivers and lakes forgetting, in clouds and sky they get their will. Here to me, the clouds and the air, the sky, is the Vairocana. That vast, undifferentiated, truly vast, empty of form, through which the bird is flying. And for the bird, like for us, do we even notice the air? And yet the bird won't fly without that air. Look how hard it was to lift off on Mars, because there's so much less air. You need that air. Without the air, the bird doesn't fly. Without the bird, the air doesn't fly. Without the water, the fish can't swim. But without the fish, there is no swimming. That vastness and where it meets one's body is where living happens. And I'm finding that thinking about today's events, whether it's the people knocking on my door, interrupting me while I'm trying to write the Dharma talk I'm now not giving to you, or hearing the news, or thinking about what I thought was going to be the theme of the talk. In the vastness of the Dharmakaya, of the Vairocana, in time and space, and beyond those distinctions, all of this is equally minuscule. But however minuscule any one thing is, or how huge it may be to any one of us, it's where those lived experiences meet that vast, empty, formless thing that we have no words for. It's where those meet that we're alive, in this moment and the next moment and the next moment. And moment after moment, what is one's own body? This body, the body of our communities experiencing what we're experiencing together today. The bodies of our ancestors, which are not separate from us, who experienced what they experienced so we can experience what we experience. Knowing benevolence, requiting benevolence. The air is benevolent to the bird as the bird is benevolent to the air, perhaps. The fish to the water, and vice versa. It reminds me of Sybil, our dear Bodhisattva elder, Sybil Mearsham Taylor, whose death takes on mythic proportions, at least in my mind, if not our community. Her death poem, I think, was something like, this boat sailing for 72 years in all weathers dissolves at last into the vast ocean itself. And I think about that, and I think about how the national teacher responds to the monk going, having missed whatever's happened here. The monk says, but what is the Vairocana of one's body? And the national teacher says, the ancient Buddha is long gone. I like to think that that's kind of, that in the moment we don't have in the koan is the moment where the monk gets it. Sort of like if my mother was pissed off at me about something and I just was not listening to what she was saying, she would perhaps look at me and go, well, maybe you just need to think about that and leave the room. And left with it, oh, then I got it. I had written, which is not my general practice, a little gatha for the talk I was going to give, and I'm going to modify it slightly off the cuff. Water in the bird bath. Spring played a large part in the talk I didn't give. Water in the bird bath. Spring birds bathe, splashing. The cat on the branch of the tree overhead pounces. The birds fly. A few moments later, a mirror, bright and pure.